All right, hello everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you this afternoon. My name is Africa Afeni Mills and I am the host for today's session. So just to get us started, I want to welcome you to the CAAASA UCLA CCEE Advancing Equity in an Era of Crisis web series. The California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators, or CAAASA, and the University of California, Los Angeles Center for the Transformation of Schools put this project together to support equity in virtual learning as we all shelter in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This work has been made possible by the generous support of the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, or as I mentioned, CCEE. We're grateful for their partnership on behalf of California's K-12 public school students. At the end of our session today, I'm going to ask you to complete a survey to evaluate our time together to see how it enriched you and how it supported you. If you're watching a recording of our earlier conversation, because we will be recording today, please complete the survey as well. Today, you'll find a link to the survey in our chat feed. We'll post it just as the session is concluding. And if you'll take a minute just at the end of the session to answer the questions, that would be a great help for us because we want to be as responsive as possible to our participants. And if you have a question about today's presentation, we hope you'll not use the chat box because that doesn't really give us a great way to get in touch with you with a response. Instead, if you click the follow-up questions button on our webpage at equitablelearningincrisis.extendedsession.com. The button for this session is right below today's listing, just below the photo, and I'll talk about the photo of the session today in a second, and the information for today's session. And so it is my pleasure to welcome Ken Wesson, who is an educational consultant with regard to neuroscience. Today's session is called Advocating for Everyone, Social Emotional Health and Learning for Shelter in Place, Best Policies and Resources. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pass the mic over to Ken. And please know that I'll be monitoring the chat too, Ken. So to give you any feedback that might be helpful within the session. And then I'll wrap us up at the end of today's session too. And so I'll just go ahead and pass it over to you, Ken.
Terrific. Thank you very much for the nice introduction.
You're welcome.
It's a pleasure to join you today to discuss sheltering in place and the social emotional health, along with the best practices that we might deploy given today's circumstances. If you can, please hold your questions as best you can, and I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. I'll even stay on later than the allotted time if necessary. And at the end, there will be a survey that will allow you to evaluate today's session and what you got out of it. And I'll also provide the PowerPoint slides for everyone that participates. As Africa said, this is an event sponsored by the California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators, along with the CEE and the UCLA Center for the Transformation of Schools. I'm Ken Wesson. I'm a former faculty member and administrator in higher education and a researcher from Stanford Research Institute. I would say that today I deliver keynote addresses to educators and administrators, but with shelter in place, I'm delivering webinars. Daniel Boorstin said, "The greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge." And we say it's not what we don't know that makes learning so difficult. It's what we think we know that is a larger obstacle to education. We've been trained to close our minds to one of the most important aspects involving learning, although it's literally right in front of our faces every minute of the day. But we've been convinced that it should be ignored, and that's the factor of emotions. Children's emotions are among the most important factors that we have to entertain if we're going to do an effective job teaching, whether at home or in school.
Excuse me, Ken, could I just interrupt you? I'm so sorry, because I'm like, I hate to mess up your flow, but some of the participants are saying that they're not able to see the PowerPoint because it's too small. Is it possible for us, because we can see the core slides and then the next slide deck, is it possible to show the slides on the full screen?
Okay, let's see.
How about now, participants?
It still looks like it's on the,
Right.
oh, okay. Yep, they said they can see it. Perfect.
Can they see it now?
Yep. Yes.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Ken. Sorry for the interruption.
Not a problem at all. Many of the slides that you'll notice will be always accompanied by a visual as well as the verbal information. And that's because research is telling us that people remember 6 times more information when it's accompanied by visual illustrations as well. Clinical psychologists are now telling us that family life has changed dramatically during the new shelter-in-place era that's been mandated, and it's resulted in a wide range of feelings of social isolation and never before seen family tensions due to being forced to function in closely tight quarters with no exit. We have opportunities to go to the store maybe, but for the most part, we're all sheltering in place and at home. And parenting is difficult in the best of times, but now we're attempting to juggle work, online schooling, parenting, and some semblance of personal space with along with personal time as we shelter in place. So we ask the questions, what are the new challenges? How do we cope? And how will a better understanding of social emotional learning help us all? Mammalian studies tell us that human beings, as well as other mammals, when they're closely packed together, we feel that there's a violation of our space. And this usually results in some highly predictable but very negative consequences. And today we have adults who are worried about job loss or ensuring that there's enough food on the table for all family members, trying to pay the rent, mortgage, car note, the energy bill, as well as other regular bills. And it's during this unprecedented time that we're encountering a very difficult time, and physical comforting becomes the most important prophylactic to stress and tensions caused by the uncertainty. And so we say that kids need far more hugs, hand holding, arms over the shoulder, kisses, sitting on laps, etc. And our role is to communicate to kids that they are physically and emotionally safe and in a very stable environment. And we say that safety is an important school concern, but it's an important home concern. And even the best equipped home, the best equipped school, with the best intentions adults will not counterbalance the need for emotional and physical safety, which are important factors for all kids and all learning. Many of you probably recall Maslow's hierarchy. And I wrote an article for District Administration Journal on saber-toothed tigers and stressed out students. And it was primarily focusing on what are the kinds of factors that impact kids when they're afraid. And as we know, kids who are physically, emotionally not safe, they feel no love, many of those kids come to school for love because they're not getting it from home. All of us strive for the kinds of things described by Maslow, but the hierarchy is important. Learning cannot take place when most of the other kinds of physical and emotional and safety needs have not been addressed for children. In today's challenge, we have food and housing instability, job insecurity, inadequate health care, and combined with the possible exposure to coronavirus 19. And when children get emotional, this is not a time to criticize them for being emotional or to respond by being equally or more emotional than the child. And we're seeing this more and more with parents. And so we say to be sure to check your own emotions before responding tersely and ask the child, how can I help you resolve this problem? And what can we do together to search for a solution to this problem?
And I'm so sorry to interrupt again. The
Yeah.
participants are saying that they are able to see the slides better, but they are still able to see your next slides and your notes. So I didn't know if you wanted to, if you're able to change the view.
Okay, well, let's see if we can. Okay, and how would we change that view?
Yeah, that's the question that I have. Eva?
No slide options.
I was gonna say. I don't know how to make it so that you can still see your notes in the next slide, but that the participants, yes, that might help.
Well,
if we go into like the presentation.
okay. I can probably go into a
presentation mode, if we go into presentation mode.
I'm in presentation mode.
Okay. So I want you to still be able to see your notes, but you know, and for the participants to be able to see the slide deck. Oh. Someone said that you can try display settings. Well, I think a couple of people said that actually.
Going to display settings, and that would be where?
Under, it says the Windows sign. Windows. Okay, wait, are you using a Windows computer?
I am.
Okay, and so someone's saying to click on the Windows sign and the letter P. That might give you the...
So that'll, okay, Windows sign.
And P. And then there was another option that you actually just showed earlier when you clicked, I forget what you clicked on, but it said swap the view. Did you see that when we were looking at it before? When it was...
Here it is. I think that takes me out of presenter mode.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, a couple of people said swap view. I use a Macintosh, so I'm just like, I'm trying to think about like what, I don't know if it's a different, let me see. Okay, so you see where it says from current slide up on the top, toward the top left. Try from current slide and see. Yeah, see for the from current slide and see what, when you click on that, what happens.
Okay, it's given. I have a second screen. Let me see if I can.
Okay.
Move my second screen.
Okay. Yes. Does that
work?
Yes.
That's perfect.
Wonderful.
Okay, good.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry to interrupt the flow, but I think we're good now.
No problem at all.
Perfect.
Okay. As I was saying, when children are getting emotional, this is no time for adults to be even more emotional. And the goal is to ask the child, how is it that we can solve these problems together? For many kids, going to school was a predictable event, and now they're staying home 24/7. And closeness is typically a human asset, but too much closeness actually leads to discomfort. And people are saying things like, you're constantly in my face or in my space. And we're seeing an increase in spousal and child abuse because of being in such closely confined quarters. And this increases stress and leads to violence. And even the best parent-child relationships are sometimes under stress during shelter in place. At the very end, I'll give you several brain-considerate tips for how to cope. We say that there's an emerging theme in brain research on how emotions interact with and influence thinking, behavior, memory, learning, attention. And what we find is that people oftentimes say, I have a discipline problem at school or at home. And I say, no, you have an engagement problem, because emotions are the real driver behind all engagement. When we're involved in task completion, we start, continue, and end a task based on the emotional state of the learner. We're motivated by desire to continue, we persist, and at the end we have the intrinsic rewards that give us some degree of satisfaction. But it all depends on how we feel. So when we talk about emotions, they're internal subjective states, and they're all private experiences that we infer, but we don't actually see what other people feel. But we infer the observable behavior based on emotions and our past experience with our own emotions and we make inferences. So when we ask the question, well, what is emotional literacy? It involves being able to identify, understand, and express emotions in a very healthy way, and doing so under circumstances that are sometimes very challenging. Social emotional intelligence and learning involves understanding how to manage emotions, setting goals, showing empathy for others, maintaining and establishing positive personal relationships, and decision making. Social emotional learning typically involves 5 different components, including first self-awareness, and that's like being able to identify your emotions, recognizing your strengths and your weaknesses. Self-management, that's impulse control, things that we typically associate with executive functions in the brain. Social awareness, things like empathy, appreciating diversity, respect for others. Relationship skills, building and maintaining relationships, working cooperatively with others at home and at school. Responsible decision making is identifying problems, identifying and analyzing solutions, evaluating those solutions, seeing if they actually solve the problem, and being ethical with one another. And these all involve the kinds of things that we want to cultivate emotionally in our children. And that's a sense of confidence, a sense of competence, the ability to persist with a task. And persistence is very important as one of the critical executive functions in the brain. The ability to develop healthy relationships and maintain those relationships, the ability to follow directions, and the ability to identify and communicate one's own feelings, and the ability to manage and control strong emotions. But all of these also involve a sense of empathy as one of the most important factors of what we want to cultivate in children. So think about children you know who are well liked and friendly, and what you notice about their behavior and their expressions of connections with other people. And we ask, what makes them different? So just take 30 seconds and think about a child you know, maybe a child at school, maybe a child in your home. And we ask, what makes them different? What typically makes them different is their display of empathy for other people. And empathy is really about the feelings from inside. And how is it that we can look inside someone else and experience what they are feeling? And it involves experiencing how they feel based on our ability to understand how we would feel given the same circumstances. The goal is to see the you in me. And if you look very carefully, you'll see the word me and the word you embedded in me. And that's how we show empathy, by being able to see you in me. The essence of empathy is the ability to stand in another person's shoes, to feel what it's like to be there and to be them, and to care about making things better for another person if something seems to hurt. And this is from the research of Dr. Bruce Perry at the Baylor College of Medicine. And empathy is really a hypothesis that we form about other people. And the hypothesis is based on our ability to gather information based on expressions that we see from them. And the empathic person senses how others feel. And we notice when we watch a movie, read a novel, or watch a tense situation, we emotionally identify with that situation and we physiologically respond to it. And this is based on something called mirror neurons. and I would advise you to take time to look up mirror neurons. They've been recently discovered at the University of Parma in Italy by neuroscientists who actually were able to identify how the brain responds to someone else engaged in identical behaviors. What happens is if you are reaching for a banana, there's certain parts of your brain that will light up during a PET scan that identify the regions of the brain responsible for motor movement. However, when you watch someone else involved in reaching for a banana, the same areas of the brain light up. And it's how we mirror behaviors and how we begin to understand and anticipate behaviors of other people. And this is why when a baby yawns, you yawn. When someone cries, we cry, and we identify with the baby getting the shot. And any parent who's taken a child to a pediatrician grimaces each time their child receives a shot. When we yawn, we respond to other people's yawns. Here's a lady receiving a shot to the eyeball, and I think most people who look at this picture will grimace once again. And that's the work of mirror neurons in the brain. But with ours is not just a biological brain, it's also an emotional brain. And it's full of every emotion possible. We typically identify 4 basic emotions: glad, sad, mad, and scared. There are 2 more that sometimes get involved in the mix: surprise and disgust. Dr. Paul MacLean identified something that he called the Triune Brain, and that was a 3-part brain that governs most of our behaviors. The first was the reptilian brain, the oldest part of the human brain or mammalian brain, and that's the reptilian brain that's involved with aggression. And then we have the limbic system, or the middle brain, the emotional part of our brain, and then the executive functions of the new brain, or the neocortex, and this is where we have our executive functions and higher order thinking. The brain doesn't really operate in the manner Paul MacLean described, but it was a very clean and very easy way for people to understand how different parts of the brain contribute to different kinds of emotions. But just like the 3 primary colors can be used to make every other color in the rainbow, we say there are multiple emotions that, when combined, can produce a wide range of emotions, and somewhere in the neighborhood of over 120 different emotions that we feel. As we talk about emotions and equity, we say equity involves eliminating barriers that present obstacles to opportunities in a given geographic area. There are legislative barriers like legal segregation, but there are consequently psychological barriers. But most importantly, the situation and emotional consequences of either is identical. There was an interesting study conducted several years ago by educator Jane Elliott, and she was a 3rd grade teacher who decided to divide her kids up into groups based on eye color. She walked into the classroom and told her students that she had just made a discovery that brown-eyed children were superior to blue-eyed children in every way possible, and that henceforth all brown-eyed children were going to receive the well-deserved treatment, and it was special treatment, and far above the blue-eyed children, because they were superior. And the 2 groups internalized their new status and began operating by the new rules. But the first thing she noticed was that the blue-eyed children became despondent and were emotionally defeated. There's an old saying, as a man thinketh in his heart, so shall he be. The blue-eyed children were not allowed to play with their superiors, the brown-eyed children. The blue-eyed children first would watch the brown-eyed children play. Then they would just sit on the benches and watch the brown-eyed children play. And then they stopped going out to recess at all. And the blue-eyed children began to misbehave, the so-called acting out. They began answering fewer questions and began performing poorly on tests, the old self-fulfilling prophecy. And as you look at the black and white photo below, you can see the faces of children, and without seeing the eye color, you know which child is blue-eyed and which child is brown-eyed, simply based on how they respond to their treatment. And oftentimes in school, we say the big challenge is not content. The biggest challenge for many children is treatment. And here's a nice summary. It says, sometimes the thing that is holding you back is all in your head. And here's a horse being held by a probably 2-pound plastic chair. But he believes he's stuck. Annis Nin said, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. It's our perception that determines what we see. For most of you, if I show you this picture and ask you who that was, most of you would say that was probably Bill Clinton and Al Gore. However, that's 2 pictures of Bill Clinton, but because you expected to see Al Gore, you did. But as you look at the face is identical. It's simply Bill Clinton with 2 different hairdos. Our expectations determine what we see. A study was conducted in Palo Alto just a couple of years ago where researchers identified students in a first grade classroom who were geniuses. And they took 30 kids, first grade youngsters, tested them, and told the teacher that 5 of them were performing at the genius level. And they asked the teacher to sign a confidentiality statement and not to reveal to the parents or teachers who those outstanding children were. The researchers came back several times during the year and monitored the behavior of the students and teachers. And at the end of the year, they retested them and gave them a similar test and found that there were kids who were performing at a high level. And guess who they were? The kids who were performing at the genius level once the second test was administered. Yes, it was the same 5 children. However, their scores on the very first test were not even close to the best scores. They were simply slightly above average. However, the quality of the teaching, the teacher's treatment of those children, her expectations increased the test scores of the 5 targeted students. And at the end of the year, the kids performed at the level of genius. And this tells us that kids will perform up to or down to the level of expectations that we have for them. One girl said, my teacher thought I was smarter than I was, so I was. Labeling students at home or at school has some detrimental effects. John Hattie conducted a meta-analysis of several studies on student learning and how students are labeled. He found that by not labeling students, that had an effect size of 0.61. And typically at the end of each year, we look for a 0.4 effect size that's equivalent to 1 school year's growth. The 0.61 was actually greater by not labeling students. In terms of brain development, which is my field, we used to say that from 0 to 3, the brain made 700 connections per second. Recent research is telling us that the brain makes over 1 million connections per second. And it's under healthy emotional conditions that are very positive that the brain thrives and grows. Every day for a child is a brain building experience, and through what we call serve and receive, where we have the interpersonal interactions where kids hear, see, watch faces, they learn from expressions, they learn from words, but it's serve and receive, and it's an interpersonal interaction. When kids have those kinds of experiences, that's what we call brain building. And these come by way of lots of social interactions. And this is part of just normal development for any mammal. And this involves loving touch, everyday experiences, conversations, talking, music, movement, interactions, reading. And we know that every child is different and one size doesn't fit all children. But we know that all children benefit by positive experiences that help develop the young brain. They also need touch. And here's a video. And Africa, please let me know if this video doesn't show. Sometimes switching screens doesn't allow.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's playing.
Okay. But we asked, well, what is the impact of negative emotions on the human brain? We saw that the brain thrives on positive emotions, but what happens with negative emotions? When we experience some degree of fear, what happens inside the brain is quite startling. There are two important structures inside the subcortical portion of the brain. One is called the amygdala, which is basically your emotional thermostat. And the amygdala monitors every situation for its emotional content. The second is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is a structure that's involved with all memory formation. And the word hippocampus comes from the Latin word for seahorse, because the hippocampus, as you'll see, is a structure that mimics a seahorse. But when a child is afraid or frightened in any way, or an adult is frightened, we see a decrease in the amount of blood going to the brain. If you'll all make as wide a V as you can with your index finger and middle finger, and place it back on your neck as far as you can, and let it rest there for just a moment, you should feel a pulse against the inner portion of your middle finger. And that's the carotid artery sending blood to the brain. When we're frightened, what happens is some of the blood that should be going to the brain gets diverted to the large muscle groups to help us fight or flight. You've all heard of fight or flight? Helps us fight or run away, during which time blood is decreased from the cerebral blood flow to the brain, and the brain is now underpowered, which is why when we're frightened, we don't think as well as we normally would. And like the little girl here who probably knows what 3 times 7 is and what 9 times 6 is, but when she's afraid, retrieving that information becomes more difficult. Negative emotions have a tendency to also decrease the robust connections that neurons would normally make under normal and healthy circumstances. Compared to healthy neurons, regions of the brain that have stressed neurons, they actually communicate weaker signals, which makes learning more difficult. Chronic stress, that is long-term stress that's unmitigated, or toxic stress, actually leads to destruction of the neurons in the hippocampus, the region of the brain responsible for memory, and also it shrinks the frontal lobe. And that's the region of the brain responsible for all executive functions. And that's planning, impulse control, the kinds of things that we see in kids who struggle the most educationally. If we think about the human brain, and I wrote another article on the brain and how fear impacts specific structures of the brain, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the frontal lobes, and the amygdala. And what we find is that stressed out brains in children and adults make you less capable of making good decisions, but also it impedes learning and long-term memory formation. And so we say safety is not just a school issue, it's an equity issue. It's a brain issue. And the American Academy of Physicians estimates that 60% of the problems brought to physicians in the US are stress related. And the greatest casualty inside the brain is learning and memory when kids are under stress. And this is why when parents are at home with additional tension, the last thing they need to do is to share that tension with children by being extremely strict, because if kids are still trying to study at home, learning and memory become greater challenges than they should be. Let's see. This video will show.
This young are extremely responsive to.
Some of you have heard of adverse childhood experiences study, and this is what happens when children are feeling some degree of stress related to abuse, neglect, and so forth. This is something called the still face experiment, and it gives you an idea of what happens when a child is feeling some degree of neglect. I'll continue.
The emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. And the still face experiment what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing. It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
And you notice this is what occurs after only 2 minutes. Think about a child who's neglected for an hour, half of a day, or a full day. And this is why we see similar reactions from children in the classroom, children who feel neglected. And we also notice that one of the most important factors determining why children drop out of school is because no one ever acknowledged that they ever dropped in. They felt ignored. And what we find is that neglect is the most prevalent form of child abuse in the US. The consequences neurologically are extreme, and here's an example of a normal child developing by age 3 and a child experiencing extreme neglect. There's a physical consequence in terms of brain development. And we see that consequence primarily, again, in the regions of the brain responsible for developing the hippocampus, the region of the brain responsible for memory formation. So we asked the question, how do we break the cycle? How do we get out of these kinds of predicaments? I wrote an article that describes what I call the SAIL concept, and that is pointing out that children need safety, acceptance, inclusion, involvement, and lots of interactions, and then children are ready to learn. And what we find is that children who experience safety concerns almost always underperform academically, and some perform so poorly that we give them an IEP, we put them in special education. When the problems are not neurological, the problems they're not academic, the problems are emotional, and they become neurological eventually. Again, we can help children by recognizing that children have a wide range of emotions and dispositions on different days. And we ask a child to talk about their emotions, asking them, how do you feel today? Would you like to feel differently? What do you need to do in order to change how you feel? Help children learn that they are indeed in control of their emotions and that they're not always reacting, that they are also controlling their emotions. And this is why we say a 3-minute emotional check-in with each child each day is one of the best ways to get the day started. In a preschool, children were asked to identify how they would like to be greeted in the morning. Some chose a hug, some chose a high five, but children were able to identify how they would like to be greeted each day. In the Natal region of South Africa, people are greeted with the expression sawubona. And sawubona means, I see you, I'm taking you in, and I like it. And that's how everyone should feel, and that's one of the best ways to get the day started. We can also start the day by giving kids an opportunity to hear very positive, inspirational music like the song Happy by Pharrell Williams. Okay, I guess that doesn't play either. Or the song Celebration Time. But any music that's 60 beats per minute or more is very helpful for children. But also getting them to start the day off by asking them, what are they thankful for as they start the new day? Having kids meditate, to just take time to peacefully think about what they'd like to do for the day and how they would like to feel. It's a good way to get the day started as we shelter in place. There are also numerous books available for children and adults on how to cope with emotions. And a great way to start the day is to begin with a little poem that we use in elementary school, and that is, today I am phenomenal, refusing to be sad. I choose to live and laugh and love. Today I will be glad. And we point out to children that happiness is a choice. I oftentimes speak to educators, particularly in early childhood education, on what I call preschool. And preschool is really based on what I call positive relational experiences. And it's the positive relational experiences that children remember best, and embedded with content is how they remember most. And what we find from research is that one of the best predictors of success in school is the relationships that kids have with their teachers or another adult in school. And kids who feel valued and respected are kids who do best in school. And it's the modeling of behaviors that kids need to see. Positive adults engaged in positive behaviors. Once again, this gets back to what we were saying earlier about the mirror neurons. Kids model the behaviors they see from adults most. And there's also a positive effect of social emotional learning on teachers, and teachers who spend time learning more about social emotional learning actually remain in the profession longer. They develop better relationships with their students. They have fewer problems with classroom management, and they serve as models for kids by regulating their own emotions. There are positive effects on students as well. Kids who get involved with social emotional learning are more likely to graduate high school, to complete college, to become stable adults and well-employed adults, and less likely to be homeless, receiving public assistance, going to jail, or ever experiencing a stay at any detention facility. And what we say is that the ratio is $1 invested for every $11 saved in social emotional learning. We say everybody should be somebody who makes everybody feel like somebody. And this means establishing a positive emotional climate at home or school, and that's showing respect and empathy, taking time for one-on-one communication, FaceTime with the child, active listening, being there, not looking at your cell phone, but actually looking at a child face to face when you have conversations with him or her, giving kids encouragement, not praise, and encouragement based on how they work hard, how they're dedicated, how they persist, not how smart they are, but how hard they actually work. And avoid put downs of all sorts, and use positive humor if you use humor, but no humor that involves someone as a butt of a joke. And building self-esteem is one of the most important things that we do with children, especially in times when they don't have the normal interactions with friends who always are very positive, which is why they remain friends. Brain considerate tips that I'd like to share with you. First, start off the day with sawubona and a hug. And we say in neuroscience that everyone should have 16 hugs a day for normal emotional functioning. And set the goals for the day. Exercise together, walk together, do homework together, have the emotional check-ins together, plan meals together, and have downtime where individuals can spend time alone, but also plan family time together. The silver lining to shelter in place is that we do have opportunities to do these kinds of things with our children in ways that we hadn't before. Other brain considerate tips: establish a regular schedule during these times of shelter in place. Being predictable is one of the best ways for kids to adapt. If the day is chaotic with no end, no beginning, when they don't know what's going to transpire in between, that kind of chaos is very difficult for a kid to adjust to. Not only plan a daily schedule, but also allow children an opportunity to participate in planning that schedule. When kids plan the schedule, you'll also gain a new insight into what are the kinds of things that your child has a passion for, where are his or her interests. And they benefit from this predictable structure primarily because the human brain responds best to patterns. And when we have patterns and routines, the brain relaxes and has a greater opportunity of learning. And the regular schedules minimize chaos and children saying, I'm bored. When they plan the day, they're less likely to say, I'm bored. And when kids are uneasy, they become unhappy, and they usually communicate their unease by becoming more difficult and very testy. When kids express their feelings, validate those feelings rather than saying, you shouldn't feel that way, or why are you feeling that way? Engage them in a conversation about how they feel, why they feel, and what ways are there for them to feel differently. Taking walks is one of the best times to have those kinds of conversations. In Africa, when someone asks, do you know Ken Wesson? Someone might say, yes, I know him, we walk together. And they don't say, I know him because I've read about him, they say, we walk together. Because when people walk together, they discuss personal challenges, their dreams, their goals. It's high quality time. Taking time to do that with your children is going to be time well spent. You also have a great opportunity to point out things to children that they wouldn't notice while driving by so quickly. There's no saying, stop and smell the roses. That's when you appreciate life the most. And it's also a great opportunity for kids to begin to understand the details of the man-made world and the natural world that surrounds them. And this is one of the best ways to get kids introduced to science. And hold hands while walking. Most men in Africa and the Middle East walk and hold hands, and they do so because that's how people walk together and show that they are indeed friends. And we should do the same with our children as we walk with them. And we say that never stop doing those little things for children. Those are the little things that wind up occupying the biggest parts of their hearts. And those are the kinds of things that will last for a lifetime. If you have children who are struggling readers, one of the best things you can do with them is to also take a book with you. And while you're walking, have them read one page on the left-hand side. And as you continue walking, you read the page on the right-hand side. And as you walk together, kids are very alert, but you'll find that kids who are struggling readers become much better readers by having an opportunity to walk and read. I've used this strategy with a number of school districts, and kids who are struggling readers begin to struggle less because the brain does its best thinking when we move. And by walking and exercising together, we also increase cerebral blood flow, which allows us to think better. In the home, establish a designated place. We say that there not only should be a time and a schedule, but there should be a designated place for children to actually do their homework or engage in personal reading. But there should be a designated place and a designated time. That's when kids adapt far better. And there should be a time frame and supportive conditions that make learning at home possible. And downtime is very healthy, and sometimes you may notice that a child may be struggling with a math problem, and the more you sit there, the more tense you get, the more difficult the learning becomes. However, when you leave the room, 5 minutes later, the child says, "Mommy, Mommy, I got it, I got it." This is what we call a parentectomy. When you remove the parent away from the emotionally challenging situation, oftentimes cerebral blood flow returns and kids can think better and learn better. If you feel tension, make sure that you leave the room rather than continue to show anger at a child, because he'll learn less the more anger you show. And we think sometimes that's the kind of discipline that encourages learning. It actually discourages learning and makes learning more neurologically difficult. And right now we're seeing more reports of child abuse and spousal abuse because parents are under pressure and having difficulty coping with the challenges. And if you're feeling overwhelmed, one of the best things to do is to think and breathe. And when you do, you get more oxygenated blood to the brain, which improves thought processing. And for parents who feel overwhelmed, those helicopter parents, one of the best things you can do is to not feel as though you must provide 100% of the entertainment for the sheltering in place child, but instead let them identify what are the kinds of things that they find emotionally fulfilling and what are the kinds of things that they would like to do. And when children participate in that decision making, you'll seldom hear them say, "I'm bored." And for parents who are struggling, there's something called the turtle technique that we recommend for children. And that is when you recognize that you feel angry, stop and think, and then take 3 deep breaths, and then come out of your shell when you're calm enough to have a thoughtful conversation and find a solution with others. This is what we recommend for children, and this is something that we're now recommending for parents as well. When it comes to adult competence in SEL, we find that people who understand and recognize their emotions are more likely to demonstrate the kinds of patience that we find most important for children. These are some of the adult competencies that we develop from SEL, and you'll get these in the PowerPoint slides. And most important, be a positive role model with pro-social behavior rather than negative or antisocial behaviors or being dismissive with children. Children learn how to manage their emotions by watching you manage yours. And this is not a good time to now say I'm going to be a very good disciplinarian and spend time trying to correct every misbehavior or identify every problem that you've noticed over the past several years with a child. This is the worst time to do so. More importantly, don't try to enforce old regulations that you haven't enforced in years, because they actually will increase stress and create more emotional distance between you and your child. So we asked the question, how do we move the needle in learning and achievement? And we truly believe that we do so by learning more about social emotional learning. And what we find is that there are numerous factors that are impacted, and one of the most important is we see that children gain 11% in standardized tests. And if you're a teacher or a school board member, there are few things more important than helping students improve in terms of achievement. But we see all kids do better from social emotional learning. So John Dewey said, we don't learn from experience, we learn by reflecting on it. And so what I'll ask you to do is to write down what was the most valuable idea that you learned from this afternoon, and write down 2 I will statements. How will you use this information shared at home or with your students who are now learning online? Okay. Just take a couple of minutes and write down 2 I will statements. And Africa, maybe we can open up and people can share some of their I will statements.
I'll keep an eye on the chat to see, do you want them to put them into the chat?
Oh, that would be the ideal place, yes.
Right. Ophelia shared that she will connect by walking and talking with my nieces. Please forgive me if I use the wrong pronoun. I'm so sorry. I'm making assumptions based on names. I will share with parents as my job is to work with parents. I will create mindful videos for students.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Others?
I will be more attentive to what students have to say.
Yes, listening is one of the most important things we can do, but listen not to critique, but to validate, especially during these times.
Oh, a bunch came through just now, so I'm probably not going to be able to share all of these, but I'll share a few more. I will call all students genius. I will check my own emotions before reacting. I will model positive emotional control. I will do more walking and talking with my own family. That's great. I will share the turtle analogy with my students and parents. I will create listening videos to bring them into the moment. I will keep calm and not helicopter over my children. I will connect by getting my kids more hugs. I will connect by being more attentive and understanding of students.
And remember, 16 hugs is what the normal regulation, well, the normal requirement is per day.
Absolutely. So I'll just share like a couple more because there was a bunch that came through. I will share what I've learned with other educators and will consider the silver lining of sheltering in place. And one more, I will teach reading while walking. What a lovely idea.
Yes, thank you. One of the most important things we can do while sheltering in place is to recognize that it is a beautiful opportunity to reconnect with our kids on levels that we have not been able to do so in the past. The other is, by doing so, we will improve their neurological chances of becoming healthy adults in the future, and the kinds of things that we see in terms of mental health problems will be minimized by the time we spend with our children under shelter in place, if we do so with brain considerate strategies in mind. And with that, I think there's a survey. Is now the time for people?
Yes, I'm actually going to go ahead and wrap us up by just, first of all, thanking you so much, Ken, because that was such a wealth of information, and that it's not only helpful for us as practitioners, but also as parents and family members. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely.
I'll put it in the chat a couple of times, but I'll put it in there again too. One, I'll send the link to the survey that we would really appreciate it if you could answer right now. And several of you asked about access to the recording and the PowerPoint slides. I'll put the website website in the chat where you can go to the website and then you'll be able to see right underneath Ken's picture in the title of today's session, you'll see that there will be like a resources tab that you can click on where you'll have access to that as well. So I'll go ahead and put those links in the chat right now. Okay, I just dropped the website, and then let me go ahead and put the survey link as well. Alrighty, I just put the survey link in as well. So thank you so much, Ken. It's so wonderful to get to know you a bit and to learn from you. And thank you to everyone for the time that you took to share with us this afternoon. Also, a couple of questions came through about, like, just generally speaking, if you're going to be attending more of these sessions, the resources will always be available at that website for the different sessions. So thank you so much, Ken.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Hopefully you found this to be time well spent.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much, everyone. And hopefully I'll see you on other sessions. Bye, everyone.